let's cut to the chase. I've been having some technical difficulties with Paul. He has things in common with Sunni orthodoxy, such as promoting predestination. Also, the idea that your primary criterion for salvation is an affirmation of a certain set of facts is also something that got expounded on significantly by Sunni and Twelver Shia traditions. Ismailis maybe less so, but that may be a more modern revision. And this is not, in my reading, what the Quran is really about. When Surah Imran is saying that the Jews and Christians will tell you you have to be one of them to be guided, but actually the religion in God's eyes is Islam, or in the Hirat of Ibn Masud, the word read Hanafiya, like that Abraham was a Hanif and a Muslim. He was the righteous one, a monotheist or a submitter. These are two different adjectives that describe a primordial default state where one is in alignment with the Haqq, even if you don't know the Haqq. And truly, who knows the Haqq? To know the fullness of the truth, one would have to be God himself. So we're all having debates about theology from a position of necessary ignorance. And to claim otherwise would perhaps be a shirk or breaking the seal of the prophets, claiming a special revelatory insight that others don't have. So the debate is, well, did Paul do this? So if Galatians is false, and this is a back projection from people who wanted to buttress Paul's standing by relying on a tradition within, like Rabbi Akiva was known to have attempted to make similar journeys into the third heaven. This was a known mystical tradition amongst the Pharisees. So that was quite outlandish. Was he prideful about the other apostles? Yeah, I think that's historically real. Acts seems like a post-Marcion polemic to mythologize these founders, much in the same way that we have a pseudo-mythologizing of the status of the Sahabi of the Prophet Muhammad. And the famous meeting in Jerusalem in Acts, where James as-Sadiq speaks up suddenly with no introduction and agrees that the Gentiles are fine with the Noahide laws and a few other things. It is an Ash'ari or Council of Chalcedon-like synthesis of what was clearly and historically evident to be a polemical divide in the early community. And in reality, probably the meeting didn't go so well. So whether or not there is a looser criteria for salvation and for virtue for people who have not been initiated into a Quranic covenant or a Torah covenant, that might be applicable to Unitarian Christians, whether or not that's true is, I think, irrelevant to the likeliness that, the high likelihood that Acts' imamate fatwa on the matter in the affirmative is false. But that doesn't mean it isn't true. And the suggestion that Hanafiya, that there's this primordial virtue in the Quran, and that the Quran is trying to liberate people from ecclesial hierarchies and soteriological social clubs in favor of something intuitive and fundamental and natural. This is a reading that some call perennialist. I would say it's simply pluralist. Now, I have become a bit more perennialist in the more legitimate definition of the term, having understood the overlays of Zoroastrianism with Islam and with the compilation of the Tanakh that we have today, and how Buddhism also came out of Persia, or was at least heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism in its Mahayana Bodhisattva variety, which is I consider to be a more monotheistic, affirmative, and virtuous version of Buddhism. But am I a perennialist, or am I just somebody who knows a lot of historical information? I'm not trying to argue that everything is equal. Otherwise, why be a Muslim? This is the argument of dilution versus exclusion. It's a spectrum. But indeed, the facts are, murky as they may be, what they are. And within these themes, I believe that we have an opportunity to open a wide door for many people in the West to come into Islam, to begin to pray Salam, to purify their Aqidah within the broad rubric of God without partners, and inshallah within a theology of justice and monotheism, as the Mutazili called themselves, the people of justice and monotheism. And this is very much in alignment with the post-Enlightenment sense of virtue that many people in the West have, and many of their complaints with religious fundamentalists is that they don't seem very virtuous at all relative to modern standards, and that they may even be the opposite. They may have a horrible energy, a demonic vibe, a vicious proselytizing campaign, which, without the checks of modern law and order, can lead to horrible sectarian violence that plunges nations into civil war over interpretations of scripture, as we have seen in Yemen and in Syria and in Iraq, and God forbid in other countries. So it's a very serious matter with very measured and factually documented consequences. And there's legitimate arguments for these secular people to not want to be associated with these Abrahamic religions. Therefore, if we are to persuade them, we must share with them the gospel that the mercy you give is going to make it easy for you on the day of judgment, and that God is primarily interested in deeds and only very basically interested in a monotheistic Aqidah. Whoever believes in Allah and the Yawm al-Din, the Yawm al-Qiyamah, and does salihin, those of the salihin, those of the sadiqeen, those who are truthful, not those who are faithful. This is a mistranslation. And that we can promote a tremendous clarity. And this is a gospel that is not as easy as what Paul preached, whereby a few affirmations will guarantee your salvation, irrespective of your sins or your laziness. And yet, when we think about the historical function of the Messiah, one of the great mysteries of the Quran, along with what is the Injil, what is the Messiah? It's Al-Masih. It's not just a Messiah, like David and Cyrus the alayhi salam, and Cyrus the Great and so forth, or even Ali alayhi salam. But this is a singular individual and a singular title, which we can then perhaps infer is rooted in Isaiah, and therefore is influenced by Zoroastrianism, because without Cyrus the Great, there would be no book of Isaiah, much less the compilation of the Tanakh that we have. That's a larger topic. So, if it wasn't for Paul, the Israel being a light unto the nations and galvanizing the monotheism of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, alayhi salams, would not have been if it was just up to James as-Sadiq as the appointed successor. He was either killed in late 30s in a mob that was run by Saul of Tarsus, but not by him directly, or he was killed by Annas the Younger about 20 odd years later. And this is said to have cursed Jerusalem and to the fall of the Second Temple, which may actually not have been the Second Temple. It might have been the Third or the Fourth Temple. There was supposedly a temple in Mount Gerizim, for example, for the Samaritans that was also commissioned by Cyrus the Great and seen through to its completion by his son Darius. But anyway, there's a very important lesson in Paul. We shouldn't throw him out entirely. We have to give him credit for being important to the spread of monotheism. And then also you have to consider that Paul was not fundamentally important and lionized in the early Christian discourse until perhaps the mid-2nd century. And this may reflect the rising tide of Gentile Platonist influenced Christians, as Marcion was, and maybe perhaps how successful Marcion was. So then it begs the question, well, then if we're going to give Paul a pass on a net basis for how much he did for spreading and marketing monotheism, shouldn't the same be said for Marcion, even though he thought that the God of the Torah was evil and a lesser deity, perhaps the way that Ishmaelis think of the universal soul, but that's a more charitable compromise on the matter. He didn't denigrate the Yahweh of the Torah, but he did think that the God that sent Jesus, Islam, Allah, in other words, the fundamental, ultimate, true God, which you might analogize to El Elyon of the Canaanite tradition, but without the anthropomorphism, that this was the true God and Yahweh was the lesser demiurge. Indeed, though, who created the universe, and that this was synthesized in the more liberal abrogational Christianity we see today, where the things that are in the Torah, some of the genocides, for example, were a product of their time and not the eternal will of God. So they have continuity in the godhood, but not in the modus operandi of God. And that's their Pauline and indeed Marcion compromise. Now, Marcion was denigrated severely by Cyril of Alexander and Irenaeus and others later towards the end of the 2nd century. And he's been relegated. He was attempted to be relegated to the dustbin of history, even though his brand of Christianity was huge. It was the most successful by far for a good 100-odd years. And then ultimately, the post-Irenaeus sieve on Christian traditions is what would have been presented to Constantine to become imperialized. So it's a very complicated history, much like the complicated history of the formation of the Sunnis, the Shias, the Malikiya, the Mu'taziliya, the Hanbaliya, etc. It's always complicated in history. It's not something you can get in a khutbah, although, inshallah, I am making an effort. So, in conclusion, when we promote a reformed concept or interpretation of Islam, which we believe to be more truthful, not that we're editing according to our desires, but on the contrary, we're trying to undo the editing of imperial desires from medieval period and present a wide open door of loving mercy and wisdom that is accessible to whoever should seek to drink of it, to make dua for it. And we encourage people to make this dua and to begin their path and to find God's guidance, inshallah. And then we might be tempted to compromise on things. So obviously the hijab is a really shallow but obvious canard. That the verse in which the hijab in the Haimar, is the actual word, is referenced, seems to be assuming the Haimar as a pre-existing thing, and it's not the direct object of the injunction, but it is in the wording of the injunction. And this is a classic thing. So usually what Sunnis will do when blonde American women, for example, convert to Islam and begin doing social media is they'll be tolerant of them not wearing hijab for years because they don't want to push people out of Islam. It's the same with people who are struggling to pray according to Sunnah, form fit, and so on. So I think that there are definitely more thorny issues than hijab, but this is a fine example. And this soft, hedged position where you're not incurring liability on the day of judgment for saying the wrong thing, but you're not being too judgmental, may well be appropriate for marketing and imamate purposes as you encourage people to stay in the deen and organize congregational prayers and so on. And whereas Paul, even in the letters that are attributable to him, and those of course have graphs and layers because people were shameless about that sort of thing, he seems to be a little bit prideful. And we have to be careful to not assume that we are so inspired that we are beyond error. So having made these hedging statements, on the other hand, I think that we have a lot to learn about the fierce mission-driven piety of Paul, or indeed Marcion, and that they got a lot of people onto monotheism, even if they were wrong, majorly wrong, about big things. And indeed, who isn't? I know I'm not right about everything, and I wouldn't want you to assume that about me. So I think you should walk away from this appreciating God's mercy and the nuance, and that the divisive Quranic rhetoric is being directed at a much smaller subset of the people who knowingly and shamelessly injected text into these canonized scriptures in order to mold the theology into an imperial religion. And of course, if you're a reformist Muslim of some kind, you'll probably judge popular Quran translations in the same way. And then I think you should feel very optimistic about the possibility of dawah, that we can do a better dawah than the Salafists have been doing. And think about, with all of the Hanbaliya, Sahih Bukhari dogma that comes with the tail of the Salafi dawah and the lack of upkeep and care and follow-up and so on, they've been very successful at bringing people into Islam. They've also been hugely successful at driving people out of Islam. And therefore, a lot of people have experienced being a Muslim, even if only for a few years on average. And they've influenced other sects and madhabs in a huge way. For instance, without the Wahhabi movement, the Hanafi Deobandi movement would not exist. This is my conjecture, but I would say there's a lot of a link there as well. And indeed, even Sufis have become hardened by having to defend rhetorically against Wahhabi criticisms. And a lot of the succor has been dried out. It's still dried honey. It's still candied. There's still something sweet there. And that as well, that we don't become prideful and judgmental about the traditional Muslim madhabs, especially the ones that have more to offer, like the Sufis and some forms of Shiism. And we want to do the dawah without polemical discourse that even Paul himself indulged in his letters, ranting about, don't Judaize and so on. You can see there's a similar parallel. And indeed, history rhymes because human nature may be able to change, but we have a lot in common with the humans of 2,000 years ago. And also that the logical folds of these religious arguments, whether they're about theology or fiqh, which is what Judaizing really was, it was a fiqh question. These logical folds tend to occur because there's something in the math and logic of how things are, that these, free will versus determinism, for example, what a sophomoric question, and yet it's still dominates people's psychology one way or the other. So let us go forth and encourage people to become Muslim, not by raising their finger and saying magic words and then joining in with the ritual. They can do that later, but encourage them to pray in an informal way at first, and encourage them to believe in one God. Free them from the idea that all of the nonsense and polemics of traditional religions truly represent God. And give them that seed of hope that God's actually reasonable and truly merciful and wise, and gives out the wisdom, and that they can get into a relationship with God. And then perhaps we can do better than Paul while learning from his mistakes. Inshallah.